The Jets get some good injury news on Jermaine Johnson, and it's extra important because the Jets are going to depend more than ever on Jermaine this season. That and more today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, June 11th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Well, the Jets are in the middle of their offseason minicamp. It is the one mandatory part of the offseason program. It's the last time this team will be on the practice field until training camp begins. And yesterday we got some news looking forward to training camp of something the Jets will be doing later this summer. We'll talk about that on today's show. We'll talk about reflections on the first day of the minicamp and how this differs from Jets minicamp 1 year ago. But we're going to begin on some positive injury news the New York Jets offered yesterday on one of their key players who's rehabbing a season-ending injury from 2024, and that player is Jermaine Johnson. On yesterday's show, we did a little bit of a preview of Jets minicamp, and one of the things I mentioned is it was going to be interesting to hear what Aaron Glenn had to say on a number of topics, whether you're talking position battles, whether you're talking attributes they're looking for specific positions, whether you're talking about some of the intricacies of the systems that the Jets are installing. Well, there's one other thing that was interesting. Injury recoveries. And of course, Jermaine Johnson only played 2 games in 2024, a lost season for him, a lost season for the Jets in many different ways, but very difficult season for Jermaine. You know, he's coming off a fantastic second season where he made the Pro Bowl. Year 3 begins, and 2 games into the season, he suffers an Achilles tendon tear and misses the final 15 games. He's been rehabbing. He's been working hard to rehab. And Aaron Glenn revealed yesterday that the Jets are expecting him to be ready for week 1 of the regular season. Now, Glenn did throw a little caveat out there. He said that Johnson may begin training camp on the physically unable to perform list. And essentially what that means is the physically unable to perform list is where players go if they aren't ready to practice at the start of training camp because they're coming off an injury. Teams usually have something called a conditioning drill, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially a test to make sure players are in prime football condition. Every team's conditioning test is different, but they're all very grueling. I mean, one team may have you have to run 100 yards in this amount of time, 5 straight times. Some teams incorporate push-ups into it. It's a very grueling affair. So until you pass that conditioning test, you aren't allowed to practice in training camp. And players who begin training camp injured obviously can't practice, so they have to pass the conditioning test. The thing about training camp is you can come off the physically unable to perform list at any time during training camp. As soon as you're ready to practice and you can pass the conditioning test, you come off the list. If you last on the physically unable to perform list into the regular season, then you have to miss over a month worth of time. But the point here is that Aaron Glenn was kind of giving a little warning here that, you may see Jermaine Johnson on the physically unable to perform list at the start of training camp, but that's nothing to worry about. The Jets are expecting him to be ready for week 1 of the season, and that's important. It goes without saying it's important because Jermaine Johnson's obviously a starting defensive end for this team, but it's more important than it would have been maybe 2 years ago when Jermaine Johnson was a rookie. And that has a lot to do with the depth the Jets have at defensive end, or more accurately, the lack of depth the Jets have at defensive end relative to much of the Robert Saleh era. There was a point during the Robert Saleh era where the Jets were, starting Jermaine Johnson and John Franklin Myers. They could bring in Bryce Huff on passing downs, and Carl Lawson could mix in here or there. Jets had a tremendous amount of depth on their defensive line, particularly at the defensive end position. And that's a position where it's nice to have a lot of quality depth. And through the Saleh era, Jets obviously had a heavy defensive line rotation. It was a philosophical thing with Saleh because they only rushed 4. They wanted to make sure they had fresh guys on every snap. But in order to successfully rotate guys in, you have to have a lot of guys who are good. And the Jets did have that for a while. This current Jets roster, they're not as good at defensive end. The one thing with the current Jets team is Aaron Glenn's going to blitz more. So the pass rushers will have extra help. Pass rushers will see less double teams. But it's undeniable that Jets defensive end position is not deep. I'm not going to say it's not good because I do think it's good. You have Jermaine Johnson, who is coming off an injury, but has been a very good two-way player. He's been good against the run and good as a pass rusher in his career. You have Will McDonald on the other side, who's the other starter, who's coming off a double-digit sack season, and by most accounts has put on some bulk, which means he may be able to hold up better as an edge setter in the run game. So you actually have a pretty good bookend to start. The thing is, unlike during the Robert Saleh era, the depth really starts to thin out after you get past that top two. I mean, I don't think any of us want to see Michael Clemens getting some more snaps. We can hope somebody like Braden McGregor grows this year, and that would be a big help to the Jets if it happened, because, even if you don't rotate defensive ends to the extent like Robert Saleh did, your third defensive end is going to see a lot of playing time. And it's not really clear that the Jets have a quality third defensive end. So the quality of those snaps when the third defensive end goes in are going to go down. You're going to see a reduction in quality the way you did not when the Jets had a lot of depth at the defensive end spot. And this makes it even more critical to have Jermaine on the field. It's one of the things we don't talk about much at the 2024 Jets, all the things that went wrong. But missing Jermaine Johnson was a big problem for this team. And part of it goes back to Hassan Reddick just being a total zero. We thought that Hassan Reddick was going to be an impact player, and he ended up providing nothing. But Jermaine Johnson was a big loss, and it was really weird because, like, if you look at the run defensive stats last year, the Jets were actually really good. But if you watch that team, you saw, like, when the season fell out of control in the early part of the year, it's because they couldn't stop the run. And Jermaine Johnson's the best run-stopping defensive end the Jets had. Now, I think the Jets will probably be judicious with Jermaine. I think early in the season, you may see him on a pitch count, which means that third defensive end will need to step up. But here are a couple of things that are important. Number one is any snap Jermaine Johnson gives you is better than the alternative. So the fact he's going to be ready for week one, that's a positive. The second thing is, although the Jets may keep Jermaine on the pitch count early, and that would be smart because he's coming off a very serious injury, as the season progresses, you'll be able to have him in a less limited way. You'll be able to, give him a regular assortment of snaps. And I think for this Jets team, you're going to need to see less rotation. You're going to need to lean on the top two guys more. And for Jermaine, the season's going to be a big test. The Jets picked up his fifth-year option, so he's still got 2 years left before he hits free agency. He's already got one serious injury. If I'm the Jets, I'm really looking at these first 6 weeks of the season. I'm looking to see, is he moving like he used to? Does he look like, even if we keep him on a pitch count, do we see a guy who is getting healthier and healthier who's going to keep improving? And if he does, that might be the time for the Jets to strike with a contract extension, because he's still pretty far. He'll still be pretty far away from free agency and maybe willing to make a deal because he just came off a very serious injury. But either way, Jets are going to need Jermaine Johnson to be a very high-end player for them this season. And the Jets don't have a lot of alternatives behind Jermaine Johnson. If Jermaine Johnson can't go, the quality of the snaps the Jets are going to get is going to go down quite a bit. So very positive news. I think there's a little bit of warning in what Glenn had to say, because I think whenever somebody begins training camp on the physically unable to perform list, there's a little bit of panic. But I think Glenn was saying, don't panic. If you see Jermaine on the PUP list at the start of training camp, he'll be ready for the season. Very positive news for the New York Jets. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, let's talk about day one of MiniCamp. Now, I'm going to warn you in advance, don't read too much into the results. It's just a practice. But I do think there is an era around this team that's very different from the era that was around it a year ago. And we'll dive into that more as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA Finals are here, and every game delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action, and FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. I know difficult to watch the NBA Finals for a lot of us in New York. I know a lot of you folks are Knicks fans. Well, if you still want to be in the action, FanDuel's the place to get in on it. And also, if you're past that, baseball season's happening right now. Yankees and Mets in the mix. Jet season not that far away. 5.5 win over under on FanDuel. If you think the Jets are going to have a big season, it's the place to get in on the action. Are you new to FanDuel? It's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. MiniCamp is underway for the New York Jets in 2025. It's the one part of the offseason program which is considered mandatory. Everything leading up to this, there's 3 phases leading into this. It's all voluntary. Now, coaches, if they're being honest, want the players there. But there's nothing the coaches can really do about it. You can't fine a player for not showing up to the offseason program. You can, when you negotiate the contract, put in incentives if the player does show up. That's one way to kind of entice players to come, but you can only incentivize it. You can't force them to come. Minicamp's different. Minicamp, everyone's got to be there. It's only 3 days in the offseason, and these are the rules the players agreed to. Last year, things were a little different for the New York Jets. I mean, we'll talk about that in a moment, but it sounds like this year you have 100% participation in minicamp, and you had over 90% participation during the voluntary phases of the offseason program. So, whatever, to the extent that matters, it seems like players, at least at this very early stage, buying into what Aaron Glenn is doing. The reports from the first day of minicamp suggested that Justin Fields looked pretty solid, led a couple of scoring drives. You don't want to read too much into the results of minicamp. There are certain things that matter, but at the end of the day, these are practices. The Jets have not even installed their systems fully yet. There's only so much you can read into the results of minicamp. But going back to what I just said about there being 100% participation, it is notable because there are a couple Jets players seeking a new contract this offseason. They are Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson. The Jets are openly negotiating contracts with them. If we flash back a year ago, there was a very notable absence at Jets minicamp. And it was the official beginning of a holdout that lasted until about 6 weeks into the regular season. And that was from Hassan Reddick, who the Jets traded for a third-round pick from the Philadelphia Eagles. And the Jets, amazingly, may have become the first team ever to trade for a player holding out. I mean, the Jets essentially traded for a contract problem. And, we can relitigate this. It didn't make any more sense at the time it was happening than it does now looking back on it. But it's difficult to not look back a year and compare that situation to what you have right now for the New York Jets, where you have 2 players who are seeking new contracts who are there. And I don't want to read too much into this because at the end of the day, players are trying to get their money. And it definitely feels like the Jets right now are working towards a contract resolution with Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner in a way they were not a year ago with Hassan Reddick. And, a year ago, they probably should not have been working toward a new contract with Hassan Reddick. Whereas right now, they should be working for a new contract with Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner. But I think that there's a lot of symbolism in all of this, because I think a year ago, the Jets were in a very different place as a franchise. And, part of it was they thought they were contenders. And, I think with hindsight, and for some of you, maybe it wasn't hindsight, we now know the Jets were not really viewing things accurately a year ago. But a year ago, it just felt like the Jets were chasing a lot of big names. And Reddick was maybe the poster boy of this. But the offseason was a very flashy offseason, because they brought in a lot of guys who were big names. They brought in Mike Williams, and they brought in Tyron Smith. And then, of course, during the season, they traded for Devontae Adams. And this comes a year after they signed they traded for one of the biggest names in the entire sport in Aaron Rodgers. And, one of the things I've discussed, not just last year, not just this year, but through the history of this podcast, is that the NFL is kind of different from most other leagues. The NFL is not a league where you win frequently by acquiring big names from other teams, because when big names become available in the NFL, there's usually a big issue with the player. In many cases, and what we saw with the Jets last year, is a lot of those guys are just old, and that's the reason they're available. In the NFL, the superstars never really make it to the open market unless there's something really unusual happening. And the unusual things usually is typically that the player's original team doesn't want the player anymore, probably because the player's production is declining. In the NFL, you have to build through the draft. It's really the only way you can win in the NFL. And that's not true in like the other sports. In the other sport, there are lots of different ways you can build. You'd like to, of course, in the other sports, you'd like to be good in the draft, but there are ways other than building through the draft to win in the other sports. In the NFL, you've got to build through the draft. And the Jets had this phase from like 2021 to 2022 where it felt like they were building through the draft. And that's when they drafted Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson. And it felt like things were improving. And then we stopped building through the draft. I mean, we made some good picks in 2023. Will McDonald looks like a good pick. Joe Tippmann looks like a good pick. But we sent a lot of picks out. And then kept doing it in 2024. And the focus moved away from building through the draft to building around these big names. And I just really feel like there's something symbolic about a year ago, Jets bringing this big name who holds out because he wants a new contract. This year, we've got two homegrown guys who want new contracts but aren't holding out. And there was another big absence last year from the offseason program, Aaron Rodgers, who, of course, went to Egypt. He had a vacation he claimed he couldn't get a refund for, which, he was making $37.5 million. I don't think it's as big of a deal for Aaron Rodgers to, lose a non-refundable trip than it is for you or I. We're not making 30. Maybe you are. Good for you if you are, but I'm not making $37.5 million. Now, truth be told, I actually think that the impact of this is overblown because, again, it's just practice. Aaron Rodgers was actually at the full offseason program when it was in the voluntary phase last year. So it wasn't like he was showing a lack of commitment to the team, but he wasn't here for the MiniCamp. And I don't think that's the reason the Jets failed last year, but I do think, again, symbolism. There wasn't any real leadership on the team last year. And I'm not just talking about the players. I'm talking about it didn't feel like there was a coach in charge last year. And, and of course, through much of the season, we had Jeff Ulbrich. But even before then, when Robert Saleh was running the team, it just never really felt like he was in charge. And it really felt like it was Rodgers' team. It felt like the Jets just kind of handed everything off to Rodgers. And it's just not something you want. And you saw last year the real pitfalls that come with something like this. The hope, I think, has to be that Aaron Glenn is actually a guy who can lead the team, somebody who can fill the leadership vacuum that's been with this team for multiple years. The vacuum Robert Saleh didn't fill, the vacuum Adam Gase didn't fill. There's been a real leadership vacuum in this franchise. And I don't want to read too much into it because I never want to read too much into anything before a coach has participated in his first game, before coaches won a game. And I'm not here to tell you Aaron Glenn's going to be a great coach because I don't know that. But I'm hoping that the symbolism that we see, that, players are buying in, that, people are here for the offseason program, guys who want new contracts. There's no weird excuses like I have a vacation I couldn't cancel. The guys are actually, you hope that that's a sign that Glenn is commanding respect. You hope that that's a sign that, something has changed with this franchise and maybe there's leadership that hasn't been. Because last year there was a clear leadership vacuum, and then what happened? The owner stepped into it. The owner started taking leadership, and we don't want that. That's not good. Now, you're on the Locked On Jets podcast. Let's move back. Let's move past MiniCamp. Jets made an announcement yesterday about how their training camp may work, and the Jets are going to be getting together with the Giants more than just when they meet in the preseason. We'll discuss that as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Wednesday. Now, some of you more experienced listeners may be realizing, hey, it's Wednesday and we're not doing the mailbag. Usually we try and do a weekly mailbag on Wednesday, but because it's MiniCamp, because we have so much news this week, decided to push the mailbag back a little bit. We'll probably do a mailbag later this week, so you have time to send in your questions if you have any. We've been talking a little bit about MiniCamp so far. Aaron Glenn's big announcement on Jermaine Johnson, the difference between this year and last year, but training camp is not that far away. It'll get going a little bit deeper into the summer, and the Jets made an announcement yesterday. It's not a big surprise, but the Jets will conduct 2 joint practices with the New York Giants in advance of their preseason game. One will take place in Florham Park at the Jets team facility. The another will take place in East Rutherford, which of course where MetLife Stadium is, but also where the Giants have their practice facility. So 2 joint practices between the Jets and the Giants. Jets have a very interesting history when it comes to these joint practices. Joint practice is essentially like before a preseason game, sometimes teams get together and they practice against each other. So the competition extends past the game, or I guess it takes place before the game. So, but the competition doesn't just take place in the game against your opponent that week. Jets had a long drought between joint practices. In fact, you go back 20 years, the Jets had a joint practice against the Giants in 2005, which a big fight broke out, and it was another 13 years before the Jets had another joint practice. Now, I actually don't think it was because of the fight. 2005 was the last year Herm Edwards was the Jets head coach. And then the Jets had a series of coaches who just didn't seem to believe in the value of joint practices. Rex Ryan had very specific views on training camp. Rex Ryan always liked to take the team away for training camp when he could. So the Jets always went to SUNY Cortland because he believed in team bonding during training camp. And, I can kind of appreciate that. I mean, the only issue is the Jets had just spent $80 million on a state of the art facility. And then they spent their period of training at some small college. It always struck me as a little odd, but beyond that, Rex Ryan didn't really believe in joint practices. Todd Bowles, his first 3 years did not have a joint practice, but the Jets did have one his last year against Washington before a preseason game against Washington. I was actually at one of those joint practices. That was another one where fights broke out, and it's not a surprise fights break out in these joint practices because it's really hot, and a lot of guys are excited to like hit guys who aren't on their team because you spent most of training camp just competing against guys on your team. So you have the opportunity to go compete against other guys, and tempers kind of flare. Guys get fired up, and fights break out. And I remember that one because I covered that one. I actually had a media credential to that one. And this was at the Washington team facility, or it was Washington's training camp in Richmond, Virginia. And this fights breaks out, and this guy who works for Washington, his one of their PR guys comes up to me and goes, "Did you take a video of that and post it to Twitter?" And like, there are like 10 other media members around me. He comes up to me as though like I'm the only one that had video. By the way, there are also like 1,000 fans in the stands behind me who were like snapping pictures and taking videos and posting it to Twitter. But he comes to me and like, it's almost like he's blaming me if like a video of this fight gets online. I actually did not have a video. So that's my training camp joint practice story, is that a guy who worked for Washington in their PR department was essentially blaming me for any video of a fight that got posted to Twitter. That was an interesting experience, but these fights do happen. And then Adam Gase came, and 2019, I don't think the Jets had a joint practice. 2020 was the COVID year, so you couldn't. Robert Saleh changed things though. Robert Saleh did believe in joint practices. And I think that you're seeing more of these joint practices rise throughout the league, especially because it seems like teams don't like using their top players in the exhibition preseason games. And I think like joint practices maybe give you a more controlled environment. Coaches have a little bit more power to keep their players safe. You can put the quarterbacks in the non-contact jersey, but you're still giving them a chance to compete against an opponent. Of course, there's not 100% safety. Jets had an injury of Carl Lawson, suffered an Achilles injury in 2021 in a joint practice against the Green Bay Packers, which really tough loss for the Jets because Lawson was one of their big free agent signings that offseason. And he was also like the only plus pass rusher the Jets had on their team that year. And the Jets pass rush really struggled without him. So, there's no such thing as 100% safety, but I do think coaches like the idea of these joint practices because it's at least they can structure it easier. You can have specific drills. You can, limit the contact of the guys you want to limit the contact on. And you can it's much easier to see specific matchups you want to see. And in the exhibition season, the other team's kind of working its own guys through. It's kind of working through its own roster battle. So you don't really get to choose which guys the other teams play. In joint practices, it's easier to say this guy, hey, you go up against that guy. It's just an easier type of thing. So it seems like Aaron Glenn also buys into these joint practices. I mean, there's the theory out there, Jets and Giants have done joint practices the last couple of years. And, so it's kind of become a tradition. I don't think Aaron Glenn cares about the tradition of joint practices. I just think that this is something maybe he believes in that can help the Jets out. There's also a very marginal benefit because you get a chance to kind of scout other teams' players out. And you may stumble upon a guy after the roster cut down day comes that might be a good waiver claim for you. And the Jets are a team that should definitely be active on the waiver wire this year because it's indisputable that the 54th best player on some teams is going to be better than the 53rd best player on the Jets roster. So I think, that's a very marginal benefit, but I think this is more about preparation. It's another opportunity to, get your guys into a competitive arena. And also because coaches don't want to really use their starters in the exhibition season, the NFL's got to do something about this exhibition season, because there really don't need to be 3 games the way teams operate. There are uses to it. It can help you sort out the last of your roster battles. If you're trying to figure out the last couple of guys you keep on your 53-man roster, it's it's really only way to determine who your return guy is going to be, because if you ever go to a training camp practice, the return, the practices practicing punt and kickoff returns are half speed, where guys really aren't tackling. So there are uses for the exhibition season, but teams don't really use it for their good players anymore, and you're seeing more and more of these joint practices rise throughout the league. And it seems like Aaron Glenn's going to utilize them, at least against the New York Giants. And I think it's also kind of a treat for the players, because, as I mentioned, you spend weeks in the heat and humidity of July and August, and you go against the same guy every single day. It's a little bit of an opportunity to, provide some freshness, give you a chance to go up against somebody else. So I think the players like these practices, even if, things do get a little heated at times, but maybe that makes the preseason games more exciting. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening, so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back next time to talk more Jets.